You're good to go.
Hi, and welcome to Better Utah Broadcast. I'm Katie Matheson. I'm the Communications Director here at Alliance for a Better Utah. With me today, I have Ralph Wilson, who is from UnKoch, my campus. So as we're starting, just a reminder, we go live every Wednesday at 12:30. We're going to have various Utah movers and shakers, although Ralph is not from Utah. He's from Alabama originally, right? But now he hails from Florida. So he's actually here in Utah. He's up in Logan today. So he was speaking at USU last night talking about a Coke donation there. But getting back, just make sure that you click get reminder when you see our videos scheduled on Mondays or Tuesdays for our Wednesday conversations. So Ralph, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, gladly. So, my background is actually in the hard sciences. Before getting involved in politics and the politics of academia, I was a mathematician and a physicist, studying chaos theory and networks. And then, essentially in 2011, when the contract between the Charles Koch Foundation and my university, Florida State University, became public, I found that terribly interesting and began researching what became ultimately my current work, which is studying networks of political corruption, as it were. I started off as a grad student and have continued in this direction sort of ever since then.
Wow, that's remarkable. Very cool. So you said 2011 was when you got involved with them?
Yes.
Got involved with the project. Now, can you give us a background or like an overview of UnKoch My Campus? When did you guys start, and what does your project kind of look like? What are you about?
Right. Well, so as I mentioned, I got involved just at FSU on campus in 2011, and we were really the first group of students to ever take the issue up. And then, for years after that, though we weren't aware of it, there were other campuses that were starting to develop similar concerns. So by 2014, we launched a national network of student groups, and that was Florida State, University of Kansas, Suffolk University, and George Mason University in Virginia, which is Koch's central headquarters, essentially. And so, it was originally launched as as a network of student groups, but it has grown, since then. And the people that we work with span from students to faculty to concerned community members, basically any member of a campus community or just the public at large, really, that has a stake in how these incredibly wealthy people are leveraging universities for policy change. And so we basically everything that we do is driven by research. We're not criticizing the political opinions of anybody or pushing back because we disagree. We analyze the contracts, we compare them to what are known principles of academic freedom and faculty governance. We compare them to university policies, which they very often violate, and we essentially go from there to point out the procedural problems, not necessarily the political disagreements that we have, but where actual rules and policies are being violated, and that's generally the approach that we take.
So you're dealing particularly with the Kochs, obviously UnKoch My Campus. Do you deal with other big donations? Is my first question, and my second question: what does success look like to you in terms of people donating to schools? We know that a lot of schools only survive because of donations. So can you kind of expand on that for me?
Yes. So, absolutely. Around the time that I got involved in this work, I was also working with students. I got involved in student activism around budget cuts. So it was very clear to us the trade-off between public money and private influence. especially because a lot of the legislators who are cutting these budgets are funded by these very same donors who are seeking influence on campus. But to the question of the other donors, the Kochs are not alone in these activities. They have a very, very specific model for leveraging universities for the implementation of policy change. And it's a direct quote from a Koch Foundation document. And so we've come to understand their strategy. And in fact, we have a full draft of the document you can see on our website at unkochmycampus.org. But this model is essentially how to convert private money into political change. And one very brilliant move on behalf of the Kochs is that they have been pulling together a network of hundreds of the nation's wealthiest donors to help them carry out this model. And so, for the most part, when the Kochs come with a very large donation, it's not just them. They have a tremendous number of partner donors who donate to their alma maters and or local universities or universities in states where they are seeking political change for one reason or another. So it's not just Koch, but it is Koch's strategy. And also Koch is by far the sort of standout example of influence, which is why we've honed in on it. But again, as I've said, our qualms aren't necessarily with Koch, but for the fact that they are this example. And so really we seek to disrupt donor influence on campus in general, whether it's on the left or the right. It just happens to be that what we've found so far is largely through the Koch network. And so in terms of the other question, what does success look like for us? Because we recognize that this is a more general problem, it wouldn't be enough, for example, if we were saying, you need to reject money from the Koch Foundation, because as I pointed out, there's hundreds of other Koch-affiliated donors who would just simply come in and present the same problems. But at the same time, we would have just as large a problem if it turned out that there were contracts that handed someone like, I don't know, George Soros, for example, the kind of influence that we're seeing. We don't see that, but if we did, we would gladly launch Unsoros My Campus. And so to us, what success looks like is much more general. We're seeking to protect academic integrity, academic freedom, and faculty governance, which are very important concepts. And so one of the things that we are seeking in terms of a solution is the strengthening of university policies. So, for example, at Florida State University, which is where a lot of this work has been done, we've compared the agreement with the Charles Koch Foundation to the university's donor policy or gift acceptance policy. And it turns out that not only was the policy very vague and very weak, and in many places unenforceable, but even that being the case, the Koch Foundation contract violated just so many clauses and multiple times over. And so not only do universities need stronger donor policies to protect faculty and students from outside influence, but they need to be enforced better. And so for us, long-term success does not mean something as simple as rejecting Koch money. It means putting larger, more broad policies in place that protect from any outside donor, left or the right, and ensures the academic integrity of the institution.
Wow. Okay. So, big project ahead of you guys, right?
Our work is cut out for us, yes.
Yes. Wow. Okay, so now let's talk about the Koch project in general. So when I was doing a little bit of research on this, it looks like you guys had laid out on your website, it looks like they've gotten into 32 states was the number I found. But you can correct me, like how vast, I guess my question is the Koch project and the Kochs and their fellow donors. How do they pick their targets? And you said, you kind of touched on this, kind of going beyond money, it's also influence. And so can you kind of speak to what the Koch project looks like?
Yes. So in terms of the expanse of the state, I mean the Kochs are funding upwards of 400 campuses I believe that the number 32 that you're referring to was something uttered by a Koch Foundation official at one of their donor summits. And I think that was a specific mention of their political strategy. And so when they have these meetings of their donor network, they raise money for their academic programs and their political programs all in the same breath. And so that was a focus of what they called a 32-state strategy. But we see their influence expands beyond those 32 states, and currently upwards of 400 universities have received this funding. Essentially, so it's very, very broad, but the work that we've been doing, again, as I mentioned, has been based in research. So about this time last year, we released a book that is available on our website called A Case Study in Academic Crime. And it's a very inflammatory title, but we stand by it because the depths of donor influence that we have been able to uncover at Florida State University and elsewhere was beyond what we could have imagined. So, the most famous findings came out about Florida State that the Koch Foundation was given explicit veto power over tenure track hiring. But in fact, continuing our research into this, we found that there were so many more strings attached, and not even all of them are strings that are laid out in these contracts. Some of them are put in place well afterwards. So, for example, we found that not only was the Koch Foundation able to influence the selection of the department chair and to have veto power over faculty hiring, but they were able to screen graduate students for graduate fellowships, including approval of their dissertation topics. They were able to create
themselves, or just the Koch Foundation.
So the Koch Foundation, all of this is, from what we've seen, these are the influence that is exacted is at the discretion of Koch Foundation officials. We have not yet seen an instance where David and Charles are on campus flipping through resumes, but in essence, they may as well, because their organizations are very, very much controlled top down, and if we find this level of influence on a public university that they're funding, we can only imagine the amount of top down pressure and influence and expectations they have within their own organizations. But beyond that, we've seen that this money has created majors that didn't exist before, created minors that didn't exist before. At Florida State, we were able to track up to 9 courses that were influenced or created by the Koch Foundation grant. The creation of student clubs, extracurricular student groups. At FSU is called the Economics Club, which sounds perfectly innocuous, but it was a free market fundamentalist student group that was created as a stipulation of the money. And so essentially from all the way upper administration, all the way down to extracurricular reading lists being dictated by the foundation themselves, the depth, the several hundred universities that have received this funding, we really only have in-depth information about maybe a dozen or two. And so, we still, even though we're surprised constantly by our findings, we are still scratching the surface, we believe.
Wow. So my understanding is that they frame it in, like you said, like an economics and a law, they put everything through the economics, law, business kind of sphere, and they give it those kind of innocuous names so that it's approved by a dean or whomever, and then that's how they kind of get their programs in. Is that correct?
Yeah, some campuses are harder for them to establish footing in than others, and so they've described, and Jane Mayer in her book Dark Money has described this very well, what they call a beachhead strategy. So, for example, their programs at Ivy League schools or schools that are considered to be particularly liberal, they don't throw around the word free market economics, or they don't throw around the word capitalism as much. But so, for example, at Brown University, it's called the Political Theory Project. So it seems very neutral. But on other campuses, they don't have to be quite as careful. And they can outright say that this is the Center for the Study of Free Enterprise, or things like that. And so they do have to be careful, and but a surprising amount of their ideology is still very, very clear. It's also a matter of knowing what to look for. Administrators that usually approve these kinds of programs, and faculty who are sort of on these campuses, no one has ever really had to adapt to this kind of aggressive philanthropy before. It's very much political philanthropy is not a new phenomena, but the degree to which these donors are aggressive and seeking very, very, very clear and very fine influence is very new. So really, what we see is that administrators and institutions are caught off guard. They don't know what to look for, and they don't quite understand the threat, and all they see are dollar signs, unfortunately. And so these programs are not only able to fly under the radar very often, but it's also the case that administrators generally don't tell campuses about the creation of these programs until after it's a done deal. Many of the faculty and students that we talk to don't find out about these centers until they see the press release.
Wow. Okay, so then let's start. When did this project from the Kochs? When did they start doing this kind of, like you say, aggressive philanthropy?
Well, and pardon me, I actually have to plug my computer in while we're speaking.
Oh, you're fine.
But Koch Industries is a family-owned business. They're second-generation owners, and their father, Fred Koch, was also a highly political philanthropist. He was an early member of an organization called the John Birch Society, which during time and continuing to this day was essentially a hyper-free market, anti-civil rights organization. And so, even then, Fred Koch, their father, was involved in creating political front groups. And using Koch Industries money to push this political agenda. At the time, they didn't really have that savvy strategy, and so the strategy that was developed, that is now in use, the one that is featured in this document that we have called the Structure of Social Change. This was developed for Charles Koch by the longtime president of the Charles Koch Foundation. His name is Richard Fink, and to our understanding, that model was developed in the late 1970s. And so Charles Koch had become involved in funding schools here and there as early as the 1960s, but really their model that made this highly effective began in the late 70s. So they've been at this for several decades now.
So there's this kind of this belief amongst generally more conservative groups that universities are kind of these bastions of liberal thought. And so is this something that was in response to that, or is this, I saw something where the Kochs kind of basically said, this is the best way to have influence in our country is basically through funding these programs that our students are, that our youth are going through. So, are they connected in any way, those two ideas?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to read through some of the earlier documents and writings of Charles Koch. He acknowledges, in the early 70s, that universities are a threat to free enterprise. He's acknowledging that left-leaning tendency of institutions of higher education says that these universities are creating people that are critical of capitalism, and It's threatening our way of life. And, so on the one hand, he recognized that these institutions were a problem that needed to be neutralized. On the other hand, it was also very clear that these institutions were creating the foundations of public knowledge, and that public knowledge is what creates the foundation of public opinion and public policy. So in order to leverage the kind of political change that the Koch family has desired for so long, they also had to not only neutralize the threat, but co-opt the institution itself. And so it's sort of, killing two birds with one stone. You want to neutralize your enemy and seize their weapons. But we've also seen, since then that, especially in our generation now, there's increasing skepticism surrounding capitalism. People are critical of what they see as the effects of capitalism in our society, and I think that scares people like Charles Koch. They, their movement relies on a constant flow of youth and talent, essentially to advance their political agenda in every state and on the federal level. And so we also see that one huge critical component for their infiltration of the universities is what they refer to as a talent pipeline. So in leaked recordings from Koch Foundation meetings, they have said that it's not just the students, graduating out of these programs. It's not just the research coming out of these programs, but it's the students that are graduating out are going on to staff their think tanks, local and national think tanks, and to staff their political front groups as well. And so they are essentially taking the sources of knowledge, and they are taking the young talent that are being produced on these campuses.
So do you guys have any data to show the students that are coming out of these programs, and are they, how many of them are coming out of these programs and then joining, like you said, getting employed by these think tanks? How many of them are running for office? Are there any conservative leaders, kind of political thought leaders today that are a result of this project? Do we know?
So it's a huge question. In one of the recordings that was leaked from the Koch meetings, they bragged that their academic network consisted of at least 5,000 people. And so in terms of a particular professor, they estimated that they could impact, several million students a year. In terms of the students that will go on to flow down their talent pipeline, it's a harder question for us to answer. So one way that we try to get at that is, when a university receives this funding, as is typical, they will have to do grant reporting every year. So they submit essentially their activities for the year to the Koch Foundation. We've intercepted, or been able to obtain some of these grant reports, and essentially those are one of the few places that we can start to see how many students they're placing in internships, working for think tanks, going on to do political work, doing political research. This is essentially the accounting for what their money is being used for. So we don't have a strong estimate because, again, it's a hard question to tackle. We don't have access to a lot of this documentation. But from what we've seen, they've been very successful in placing students in their internships, pushing them through these other free market institutions, and some of the training grounds as well, the Institute for Humane Studies, and a lot of these organizations that put on conferences and place students in internships. There's a very robust and successful effort on behalf of these professors to carry out the donor's intent.
Wow. So now let's talk about Utah. So you were here, you're in Logan, you were at Utah State University. So there was a big to-do last year about this $25 million, is that right, Koch donation that was matched by the Huntsman Foundation for the Huntsman this school, is my understanding. And so I know that there was a protest, at least one. There was a big image that was put on the side of one of the buildings, just basically protesting this donation. And can you tell us a little bit about the Utah donation itself? Why USU? Why was it sent there? And then who invited you? And then just the whole situation at the university up there.
Sure. So, yeah, this was a very large gift, and when we see these large multi-million-dollar programs being created, it's usually because the Koch Foundation has already had success on that campus. So there's sort of stages of progression that we've seen. The first year that a school gets money from the Koch Foundation, very often it's almost just testing the waters. So you might get a few $1,000s for a reading group or a speaker series, and if that goes successfully, doesn't meet with much dissent, or if it produces the desired effect, if they get some student talent out of that, then it will progress further. And sort of the end case being, something like this multi-million-dollar center being created. And so at USU, they have had essentially have a track record of producing results for the Kochs, and they have successfully already created what was not only a center on campus, but a sort of sister organization that was a standalone 501c3 think tank called Strata that was connected to campus. And so this was very important for the Koch Foundation because it essentially allows them not to fund USU, but to funnel their money through USU to a think tank that does overtly political and policy work. And so they were very, very successful, and Strata has been incredibly successful in training students, in producing anti-environmental research and policy, privatization of lands, especially in Utah. Strata has led the way in terms of privatization of land. And essentially, it's been worth their money. Koch is this new gift is an affirmation that they like what has been coming out of it. So much so that they've done it again, and so the creation of a new center now that's very much essentially a new strata. It's the Center for Growth and Opportunity, I believe. It's yet another standalone 501c3 think tank that is funded through USU, but is a standalone legal entity. And so, Strata was so nice that they had to do it twice. So really, it's just an affirmation of the amount of success that they've had here, that they are going to double down. And when an administration allows that sort of thing to happen, it's not common. There are only a few other schools that we've seen where they've been able to create their own think tank and then essentially buy the name of the school to put on it. And so when you have a university administration that allows this to happen, when you have faculty and departments that are complicit, that's an opportunity that you don't want to let go to waste.
Yeah. So, wow. So at the end of the day, the Kochs, they will see their own success as basically inundating the United States and, possibly beyond with the ideas of as much of a free market as possible. Is that the be-all, end-all?
Yeah, a lot of the times people characterize Charles Koch as a conservative. We fundamentally disagree with that, and I think Charles Koch would too. He calls himself what they call a classical liberal, which actually, when you dig down into the roots of the term, it comes from Austrian economics, and all it means is anarcho-capitalist. And so the end goal politically for Koch and their network is full anarcho-capitalism, full corporate control, and the full and final erosion of the U.S. state.
Wow. Well, on that happy note,
yes.
Let's wrap it up. So how can people get involved with UnKoch My Campus, or if I know that there's some stuff going on up at USU. If people at other universities in Utah are curious about the donations made to their school, what can they do? What kind of resources do you guys have?
Yeah, well, we have a small staff, but we're essentially on call at all hours for people who are concerned or who are interested to learn more. Currently in Utah, there's not just USU and recent University of Utah, but Brigham Young University, Southern Utah University are also receiving funding from the Koch Foundation. And essentially, as I maybe mentioned at the beginning, everything that we do is based in research. And so that is what when we support students, or when we support faculty, or we support community members, it is to help them get a better understanding of what exactly is happening on their campus. Because while we have every reason to assume that what we find is typical, anytime that we go to a new campus, we start from scratch. We say, okay, what is the money doing here? Does it appear that there's been any wrongdoing, any violation of university policy? And so that involves looking at the university policy. Does the university even have a policy about donor influence or anything like that? And so really, those are the kinds of starting questions that serve as the foundation for any resistance or any further inquiry. And so we're essentially on hand to help walk people through these questions and figure out, what's happening and what can be done.
Cool. So do you guys, are you on Facebook? Is there a website, email? How do they reach you?
Yeah, so our website is unkochmycampus.org. I'm Ralph at unkochmycampus.org. Feel free to write to me directly. And we're on Twitter at UnKoch Campus. We're also on Facebook at UnKoch My Campus, in all the normal places. But we're pretty much field requests and concerns from all corners of the globe. And this problem is international as well. So we're available to help in any way.
Send all the emails from all the countries. Great.
Yes, please.
All right, and everybody, as usual, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Better Utah. Subscribe to our emails to get updates about the legislative session. I think we only have 15 days left. I feel like we've always been in the legislative session, but you tell me there was a time before it. And make sure to join us next week at 12:30. And thank you, Ralph.
Thank you so much.
Bye.